we would like to discuss the making of a champion. It will be very exciting, and we want you right with us during that entire moment. The first thing I'd like to say regarding a champion is the awakening of a champion. Greatness must discover itself. I am sure that there has been greatness, much greatness, in history that was never discovered. Maybe the greatest scientists who were ever born never got to become a scientist. Maybe the greatest leaders that were ever born on the face of this earth never got to lead. I am sure of one thing: greatness has to discover itself. It's very strange, but great men rarely recognize their greatness. They live under intense situations. Urgency is upon them, and they do things because of an urgency on the inside of them. And they do not recognize this as greatness. They recognize it as necessity. Most great men must be awakened by circumstances or by other persons challenging them. In this nation where we stand now, Ben-Gurion, born in Europe under very severe circumstances, coming to this land under very severe circumstances, could hardly believe that one day he would be its first prime minister. But he became that. He was a true champion, a political champion, creating a nation and becoming its first national leader. I am sure that David, being about the seventh son, in a family, could not realize it. He was a champion until one day he was challenged by a bear, and he didn't run away. Another day he was challenged by a lion, and he didn't run away. And later he was challenged by a giant, and he didn't run away. Because David, in all of his life, never ran away from an enemy. He attacked enemies. That's what we mean by champions. They don't run away, they don't hide, they fight. When David went to battle to see his brother's war, and he found Goliath there, he heard his brother say, "Oh, we can't hit him. He's too big." David looked at him and said, "Yeah, he's big. I can't miss him." So you have two vast ideas about bigness. One said, "He's so big, I'm afraid of him." And the other says, "He's so big, I sure can't miss him." That's the way with problems today. A problem that one says, "I can't tackle that. It's too big." Another one says, "Man, that thing's so big, I can't miss it. I'll tear it to pieces." That's the difference in whether one is a champion or whether he is not a champion. David got through with that giant. He made a deep impression on him with a stone right between his eyes. God can give you favor. God can give you anointing. God can give you strength that you can be God's champion, and the devil can't do anything to hurt you. With this young man David, that after he killed that giant, he became a national hero to the people because he was not afraid. And then later we come to a time in history where Israel's last great champion for 400 years came, and that's one we wish to really discuss with you. His name was Nehemiah. Nehemiah, the very word means Jehovah consoles. In those days they meant, words meant a lot and names meant a lot. Jehovah consoles and comforts. He needed that because he was a slave. He was reared in a foreign country. He had everything against him and nothing for him. And he needed that. Nehemiah discovered his source of help and strength was Jehovah. Not his own mind, not his own physical strength, but that Jehovah was his mighty source of wisdom, knowledge, and strength. Historically, Nehemiah was the last of the great national champions in Israeli history. He was like a bright and shining star, shining in the darkness of a hurt and crying nation at one of its darkest points in history. We discover that this person, Nehemiah, who was a true champion, was a patriot. He loved his own country. He was a statesman. He knew how to stand before kings and emperors. He was a man with a remarkable knowledge of the Most High God, evidently through prayer and the reading of the Word of God. He had come to know God. We discover that he was not only a political person, but that he was a builder. This man, who lived about 400 years before Christ was born, left his imprint upon history as the last of his kind for at least 400 years. Would you like to be the last of a certain kind? Well, not exactly. Would you want to be the last, but you could be the last, you see. What comes after you, you're not responsible for. You're responsible for right now of being a champion for God. It's most remarkable that Nehemiah rose to power at one of the most luxurious courts in all of history, the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great ruled in autocratic splendor. And here this young man was a slave from Jerusalem. He had learned their own language and spoke it eloquently. He had worked hard. He had not wasted his time. He had taken advantage of every opportunity. But down inside of him was pure steel. Down inside of him, he had a backbone that would not bend. He was a champion for God. He lived in a time when empires were struggling. He saw the dying embers of the ruined Babylonian Empire as it burned. And about 500 before Christ, he saw the mighty ruling Persian Empire crest at its highest of ruling the world. That great emperor, Cyrus the Great, had united Media and Persia, had made it the great historic Persian Empire. That empire captured Babylon, Syria, Palestine. His son Cyrus, Cambyses, added Egypt to the empire. In the 400s before Christ, Darius, Persia's greatest leader, ruled from India to the Orient, and the Orient to Greece and Europe and Africa, covering most of the world of that time that was energetic and fighting. The Persian throne was located in Shushan, in the city of Susa. Darius had created tremendous government, had an amazing mind. He had disciplined armies that obeyed commands. He issued coins for commerce so men could trade. He built roads for commerce and communications. But that country of Persia lost its first battle at Marathon to the Greeks. And that was the beginning of their lack of champions to control the world. Because 10 years after that, Greece defeated Darius' son Xerxes in a naval battle at Salamis. and the Persian Empire began to slowly break up from lack of champions. Empires cannot persist without champions. There has to be mighty men, strong men, courage, men of courage, in order to have strong nations. And 330 before Christ, Alexander the Great conquered all of Persia, and the Greeks now ruled the world. For some 80 years, they ruled the world because they had champions. Dr. C.I. Scofield, in his reference Bible, says that Nehemiah led his army of builders out of Persia to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, where I'm standing right now. In the year 444 before Christ, that was a moment of great activity for the champion that we're studying about. This was about 100 years before the Grecian Empire began to rule the world. So he was fortunate to be born in a time where his greatness could be used and where he could thrust forth and be the person that God wanted him to be. This man Nehemiah, who was one of God's champions, I wish to tell you his story very clearly. In Nehemiah 1:1, he tells you that I am Nehemiah, and that I was in the palace, highly esteemed in the palace. And so the author of the book of Nehemiah identifies himself. He had already reached his peak in the Persian court, highly respected. And one day in this many activities of a person in high-ranking court of an empire, in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 2, it says, Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left to the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem, the city where we're standing right now. Get the picture. A man who was a former slave named Nehemiah, now living in splendor in the richest palace on the face of the earth, working with an emperor who ruled all the standing armies of the world. No doubt he thought he had already achieved and that his lifetime was now ebbing the other way because he had already done all that he could do. He was highly honored in the court and by all the great men that came through the courts of the Persian Empire. He was in the presence of the emperor every day, which was a high honor. Very few people had it. He tasted and served the royal vintage to His Majesty, the emperor. But some way or another, his poor kinsman found him. It's been my experience that poor kinsfolk can always find you. They gravitate toward their successful kinspeople. Dignitaries are always easy to locate because people are talking about them. This champion had deep yearnings to know about spiritual things. He asked about God's city, Jerusalem, and God's people, the Israelites, how they were doing. And Nehemiah 1 and 3, it says, and they said unto me, the remnant that are left here in Jerusalem of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. And so Judea was called a province now, not a nation. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. The gates of Jerusalem are burned with fire. He got a report of God's work. Many things he could do, at that time, if he had wanted to do them. But here we begin to discover what a champion really is. In the next verse, in Nehemiah 1:4, it says, it came to pass, when I heard these words, the walls were broken down, the stones were gone, the gates were burned with fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and I wept. And then I mourned for certain days, and I fasted. He sat down, that means he stopped running around. Some of us never get quiet enough for God to really do something for us. He mourned, he wept, he fasted. It says, before the God of heaven. Before the God of heaven. He heard the words telling about the city and its destruction. His emotions responded. He wept and he fasted. What that really means, I wish I could say it stronger. He got involved. He really got involved. Some people hear, but they will not get involved. Nehemiah could have said to these men from Judea, brothers, I've given you 30 minutes of my time. I'm going to give you a purse now with some money in it. I've got a royal engagement awaiting for me, and you can't keep the emperor waiting. He says, I'm glad to have seen you. I'm going to be praying for you. God bless you now. Now that's the way most people would have responded. But Nehemiah didn't do that. He said, how is the holy city? Then he put his head down and he listened. And when they said it had no walls for protection and no gates, that the people were miserable and hungry, it was the awakening of a champion. What did he do? In verse 5 he said, I prayed to Jehovah. He went to the right source with his problem. He said, O Lord of heaven, the great and mighty terrible God that keepeth the covenant and mercy of them that love him and keep his commandments. Nehemiah addressed the proper source. Oh, that we could go to the right source to get our directions. In verses 6 and 7 of chapter 1, he said, let your ear be attentive to me and and let thine eyes be open. Hear my prayer. And he says about all the children of Israel have sinned. Both I and my father's house have all sinned. He confessed sin. We have dealt very corruptly against you, and we have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes and the judgments. No doubt he was a good man, but he was confessing for the whole nation. Nehemiah pled with Jehovah to listen to him. He confessed the shortcomings of his nation. He included himself in his father's house. He had no self-pity and no self-righteousness. He moved in to say, there's something we got to do, and we got to do it now. In Nehemiah 1:8, he says, remember, I beseech you the word that you commanded thy servant Moses. He went clear back to the great champion Moses. Says, if we transgress, you'll scatter us among the nations. They knew that, you see. But if we return and keep your commandments to do them, we that were cast out into the uttermost parts of the heavens, that you would gather us hence, bring us into the place that I've chosen to put my name. That's here in Jerusalem, where we are right now. So Nehemiah requested God to remember his promises that he had made to Moses and said, I want you to keep those promises. So, as Nehemiah listened to the sorrows and needs of the great city of Jerusalem, God's city, the mystery of greatness took place. What an amazing anecdote to all of history. The mystery of the awakening of an immortal soul took place. Really, a champion was born at that point. He had been great before, but not so great as he was now. The power of motivation, of leadership took action. Nehemiah had permitted men of less influence and leadership to come into his presence, his kinspeople. He gave them to drink and to eat. Then he listened to the truth and to reality. And then Amazing how God takes a nobody and makes a somebody out of him. He takes a person which others cannot see leadership, and he uses them to reveal championship. Behind every champion, there are those that help, there are those that help, and there are those that inspire, and there are those that says, listen, I want to do something to bless and help. Something happened here. Nehemiah no longer desired the royal courts of Persia. He no longer desired the beautiful garments that the king gave him. He no longer desired the delicious food placed on the table. He no longer wanted to greet ambassadors from other nations, bringing their gifts to the emperor. All of this now seemed as nothing until the things of this world become nothing. You cannot become a great champion of God and his people. That is not possible. Here was a man that moved into commitment, tremendous equipment. His past, he'd worked on maybe for 20 years, you see. And he had achieved, you see. Now he was going to lay it all on the line because he was now to be a champion for the people of God. He saw walls that were not built. He saw gates where there were empty sockets and holes. And he said, I will not live in this splendor. I won't walk in these courts. I will rise up and be different. That's what a champion is. In this series of lectures, the making of a champion, I'm crying out to God, well, for 1 million champions in our land. We can change the world. Champions change things. Champions rise above themselves. Champions come into resources that nobody else has on the face of this earth. Champions are willing to place anything, everything on an altar and say, hey, I sacrifice everything. I don't hold anything back. That's what we mean by a champion, you know? And here we find one. Here we see him in his mental abilities and in his mental powers. He rises high. And then at that point, he's challenged. And then what's really on the inside of him comes out. The true man comes out. The real man comes out. What he was done on the inside, he was a champion. Everybody had to know it. And so God today is searching, sometimes through the rubble of our land, sometimes through the drug culture, sometimes through the broken lives, searching for men and women who are now ready to be mighty champions of the Most High God. I'm calling upon you to be a champion, to take off the garments of your own attainments and to lay aside your own achievements and be a champion for our God right now, to bring change to our world, to bring blessing to our world, to bring millions of people to God and to heaven. Will you be challenged to be a champion for God? He can use what you have right now to make you an outstanding person. Believe me, you can be a champion.